I'm Casey Kasem, and this is American Top 40's Worldwide DJ Poll, our exclusive survey of the giants of rock and roll. We asked radio professionals around the world which acts during the rock era have had the greatest influence on the music of today. And in this show, we're counting down the results from number 40 to number 1. Who's going to be the most influential? We're on our way to the answer. Now, on we go.
Number 29.
We're up to a superstar who ranks as one of the greatest producers of all time. As far back as the early 60s, he was producing big hits for Leslie Gore like It's My Party and Judy's Turn to Cry. And in the years since, he's produced dozens of artists, including Louis Armstrong, Ray Charles, Little Richard, Frank Sinatra, Aretha Franklin, and Herbie Hancock. He also produced the biggest selling album in history, Michael Jackson's Thriller. And he was the producer and the guiding soul behind one of the biggest selling singles ever. A song which sold 8 million copies and raised a lot of money to feed the famine victims in Africa. Disc jockeys from around the world placed the great Quincy Jones at number 29 in our special survey.
Casey's Top 40.
I'm Casey Kasem. Well, now we're up to a man who's had an unbelievable 69 Grammy nominations, yet he never plays or sings a single note. He's 56-year-old music legend Quincy Jones, and he's been in music since he was a teenager in the late 40s. When he was 17, he left Seattle, where he was raised, and went to Boston to study at the Berklee College of Music. To earn extra money, he would play his trumpet in local clubs. Well, after a while, word got around about this young man's talent, and that's when his career really took off. First, Quincy was hired by jazz great Oscar Pettiford. Then he toured with other jazz giants like Lionel Hampton and Dizzy Gillespie. By the end of the 50s, Quincy had become vice president of Mercury Records, the first black person to hold such a high office at a major record company. In the 60s, Quincy's fame continued to grow. He wrote the music for movies like The Pawnbroker, In Cold Blood, and In the Heat of the Night. He also did the music for TV favorites like Ironside, Sanford and Son, and the landmark miniseries Roots. What's more, he produced and arranged songs for a virtual who's who of music. Frank Sinatra, Diana Ross, Donna Summer, Henry Mancini, Little Richard, Aretha Franklin, Duke Ellington, Paul Simon, Louis Armstrong, Johnny Mathis, Ringo Starr, and dozens more. And as a producer, Quincy's biggest claim to fame was Michael Jackson's Thriller, the biggest selling album in history. In all, Quincy Jones has been nominated for an unbelievable 69 Grammy Awards, more than any other record producer in history. And he's so well respected as a producer that when it's time to release albums under his own name, he doesn't even play or sing a single note on any of them. He just gathers a group of top talent together and does what he does best: produce. The top talent Quincy Jones gathered for his latest album, called Back on the Block, includes George Benson, Ella Fitzgerald, and Sheila E. Not to mention Chaka Khan and Quincy's boyhood friend, Ray Charles. Ray and Chaka are featured on the song that leaps 7 notches to number 25 in this week's survey. Here's I'll Be Good to You.
Casey's Top 40.
I'm Mark Elliott for Casey Kasem. Now, we're up to the story of how Quincy Jones learned to travel America in style on just pennies a day. You see, it was back in the early 50s that a teenaged Quincy began to tour as a musician with jazz giant Lionel Hampton. Quincy earned $17 a night. Not exactly a king's ransom, even in those days. So Quincy began to watch the older musicians to see how they survived on the road, and they taught him some valuable lessons. First, he learned to avoid hotels. He'd go instead to private homes where people would rent a traveler a room and feed him a meal for just $7 a night. The other musicians also taught Quincy where the cheap restaurants were in every town, places to get a filling meal for only $2. And when the band played in Harlem, they taught him how to go to a mission run by an evangelist named Father Divine. At Father Divine's, you just say to the man at the door, "Peace, brother," and they'd feed you for only 15 cents. The older musicians also taught young Quincy how to take care of his clothes, how to keep them neat without paying for a laundry. Each night, they'd take off their pants and carefully lay them out under the mattress so they'd get pressed while they slept. They'd wash their handkerchiefs and spread them out on a mirror so they'd dry flat and neat. Finally, they'd put their jackets in the shower, turn the faucet to one side, and crank the hot water up full blast. That would act like a steam iron and remove all the wrinkles. Quincy says watching those older musicians was just like going to school, and he learned a lot more than how to keep his clothes neat. Quincy learned music from the masters. And when he went from playing in jazz bands to a lucrative career as an arranger and producer, all those musical dues paid off. Quincy's become one of America's top producers. In fact, he's the man who produced the most successful album in history, Michael Jackson's Thriller. Quincy also produced the song that climbs 2 notches to number 23 in our survey this week.
Casey's Top 40.
I'm Mark Elliott in this week for Casey Kasem. Now, it's time to open our Casey's Top 40 scrapbook to the chapter on the Grammys and the section on the man who just became the most honored pop artist in the history of those awards. The biggest Grammy winner of all time, of any type, is classical conductor Sir George Solti of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. He's won 28 Grammys. And until this year, the most honored pop artist was composer-conductor Henry Mancini. Over the past decades, he's won for classics like Moon River in 1961 and The Days of Wine and Roses in 1963. By 1970, Henry Mancini had collected 20 Grammys, and that record for the most Grammys has been his for the past 21 years. But this year, that record fell. It was surpassed by a superstar arranger, composer, and producer who picked up 6 Grammys for the album Back on the Block, including Album of the Year and Producer of the Year. And that gives Quincy Jones a grand total of 25 Grammys, making him the most honored pop artist in the history of the awards. A big tip of the Top 40 hat to Quincy Jones. Now, here's a young artist discovered by Quincy Jones, a teenage singer who appeared on Quincy's Grammy Award-winning album Back on the Block. Rising 3 notches to number 12 on Casey's Top 40, Tevin Campbell with his first solo hit, Round and Round.
Casey's Top 40.
I'm Casey Kasem. We're counting down the most popular songs on this week's Pop Singles Chart. Well, now we're up to the first Top 40 pop hit for a 14-year-old Texan who made his singing debut on an album that recently won 6 Grammys. This singer from Dallas was only 12 years old when producer Quincy Jones noticed him on the children's TV show Wally and the Valentines. Quincy was knocked out by the boy. He thought there was something very, very special about young Tevin Campbell. And so at the tender age of only 12, Tevin found himself in a recording studio working with the likes of rappers Ice-T and Melly Mel, along with Ray Charles, Chaka Khan, Bobby McFerrin, Al Jarreau, James Ingram, and many more. Musicians Quincy Jones had handpicked for his album Back on the Block. Well, on the night of February 20th, that album earned a staggering 6 Grammys, including the award for Album of the Year.
Casey's biggest hits.
5 years ago this week, one of the biggest hits in the USA was The Way You Make Me Feel, a song produced by the man with the longest span of #1 hits in the rock era. I'll have details and that big hit after this.
Casey's biggest hits.
5 years ago this week, one of the biggest hits in the USA was The Way You Make Me Feel, a song produced by the man with the longest span of #1 hits in the rock era. This super producer's first #1 was the Leslie Gore smash, It's My Party, way back in 1963. And the most recent #1 song produced by this music business legend was in 1988. That gives Quincy Jones 25 years of #1 hits, the longest span of #1s for any producer in the rock era. 5 years ago this week, one of the #1s Quincy produced was one of the biggest hits in the USA.
Casey's Top 40.
Well, now we're up to our tribute to the super producer who's earned more Grammys than any other pop artist in history, a man named Jones who celebrates his 60th birthday this week. To those who knew him when he was a boy, it was obvious he was marked for greatness. He began studying trumpet when he was in grade school, and by the time this future super producer was 14 years old, he had formed a group with an up-and-coming piano player and singer named Ray Charles. Together, they played soul clubs around the Seattle area. A year later, at the age of 15, the future Grammy champ was playing with jazz great Lionel Hampton. Before he was 20, he had played with jazz greats like Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, Miles Davis, and Charlie Parker, the best of the best. By the early 1960s, this musician turned to producing, creating pop hits for Leslie Gore like It's My Party and Judy's Turn to Cry. And he started writing, too. Over the years, he's composed the music for dozens of films, including The Pawnbroker and In Cold Blood. He even earned an Oscar for his soundtrack for In the Heat of the Night. And there were also Grammys, loads of them. He won Grammys for his albums The Dude and Back on the Block. And he also won big for Michael Jackson's album Thriller, the biggest-selling album in history. In all, he's won 25 Grammys, more than any other musician from the world of pop. And he's nowhere near stopping. Along with his continuing activities, recording and producing, he's launching a new magazine with Time Warner, a magazine called Vibe, devoted to the world of rap, rhythm and blues, dance, politics, and fashion. All of this as super producer Quincy Jones celebrates his 60th birthday this weekend. Happy birthday, Quincy. Now, on with the countdown.
Was the week before Christmas in AT40, and all through the countdown, hits keep coming. And next in American Top 40 at number 16, Tevin Campbell and his current hit. Tevin told us some advice he's never forgotten. It came from the man who produced two of the biggest albums in history, Thriller and Bad. And he's worked with everyone from Michael Jackson to Frank Sinatra. Tevin Campbell told us what Quincy Jones told him.
The one thing he told me when I first met him, and he's always told me, is to write music because that's where you make the money. And he always tells me it's very important because when you're singing your own lyrics, then you feel it more, you know. It's like you're singing from your heart, and the people that are listening to it can feel it along with you. So that's one of the most important things that he's told me.
The hits from coast to coast.